For those of you who don't know, Dr. Pawluk, he wrote the book Supercharge Your Health and Healing with PEMF, or yes, PEMF therapy. And just without any further ado, I mean, he's considered really the world expert on this technology for healing and recovery, chronic pain and things of that nature. So I'm really excited to get a deep dive into this. You know, some of the questions I ponder is like, I don't really have any complaints. So should I see a response to PEMF? And then I have a very dear friend, Dr. Carter and I do, Dr. Tony Sincetta, DO down in Ocala, who works in pain. And he says he doesn't really see any benefit from some of the low power ones. And they have, you know, in one of their clinics, they have a very expensive one, and he feels like he gets a lot of benefit.
Okay, so who am I? I'm a former family physician. I did years of a holistic and functional medicine. I'm trained in acupuncture through a UCLA program for doctors, also training in functional medicine, nutrition, homeopathy. Basically, I've done the gamut. And part of that gamut was my own learning process for finding other technologies other than obviously conventional medicine for helping people. I considered myself an unhappy doctor. As an unhappy doctor, I was basically always looking for solutions, better solutions for people, for their health. And so I explored all these technologies. And eventually what I came down to, my realization was that the best value for, like, if you talk about cold laser, you talk about HBOT, you talk about ozone therapies, you talk about most other of these technologies, they're expensive. They're additive, but they're expensive. So if you had a limited number of dollars to spend on a technology, the best value would come from getting the right, that's the key, getting the right PEMF system. So anyway, I started originally with acupuncture magnets. I co-authored my first book called Magnetic Therapy in Eastern Europe, a review of 30 years of research. I met an MD PhD from the Czech Republic who had translated a lot of that science. Until about the late 80s, we had virtually no access to PEMF therapy research because it was all behind the Eastern Bloc, if you will, right. And in foreign languages, Cyrillic, German, Russian, etc. And then basically, as I continued to use magnetic field therapy, I started originally with static magnets because of my training in acupuncture. So magnets put on acupuncture points, essentially. But I discovered that magnets were doing a whole lot more than just acupuncture. And I've since then basically stopped doing acupuncture, and all I do now is basically work with magnetic fields. So as a result of my interaction with Dr. Jerabek, I got devices like the QRS, low intensity PEMF systems, because that's what was available at the time. And there's a lot of selling going on in that equipment. So I was introduced to it. I said, that's fine. Let me go with this equipment as it is now. And I continued to work with the science. I continued to research articles wherever I could find them, beyond what I knew already in the Magnetic Therapy in Eastern Europe book. And we have tons of references in that book. But that book is very summarized, highly summarized. So it's very challenging to read. You have to really dig into the science to be able to absorb and use the information in that book. So along the way, then I ended up publishing Power Tools for Health, How Magnetic Fields Help You. So that book has about 500 references. And along my journey, I discovered all the different things that magnetic fields do in biology, not just the human body, but biology, whether it's a dog or a cat, a human, maybe even an elephant, and so on. So there's over 500 references. And I reviewed the science of about 50 different health conditions. A lot of that overlaps with what the Russians had found, or what I found in that magnetic therapy book, but a lot of new information. And continuing to work with magnetic fields, Power Tools for Health book was not really a manual. It wasn't that practical. And people like the science. Those of us who geek out on the science, we like the science. But then, okay, now what? And so as a result, I published Supercharge Your Health with PEMF Therapy. And that's a much more practical manual type book, which could be much more useful for the clinician, or even for the average consumer. So again, I studied functional medicine. I was on the Oz show. I co-hosted a holistic radio show for 10 years in the Baltimore area. A lot of interviews, publications, and so on. And the biggest thing that I have besides the books is the website, drpawluk.com. And I would, again, if you don't want to buy the book, that's fine, but drpawluk.com has a huge amount of information. It's a very big, robust resource for magnetic field therapies. So we can cover some of the things we'll cover is the basics of PMS, physiologic actions, the concept of the healing timeline, which clinicians all have in their own heads, what tissue, what problem, how old a person is, what's it going to take to heal this problem. Hypersensitivity, contradiction, safety, whether you use it at home or in an office setting, if you do chemo or radiation, surgery, how does that all fit in with the PMF therapies? So the advantages of magnetic field therapy in general, it's non-toxic, not invasive. The magnetic field passes completely through the body as if the body wasn't there. So if you did a measurement, you had a magnetometer in here, and you have a magnetic field here. If you put a body in between those, there's no difference. Zero difference in the measurements. So that's important because, again, that's critical because the magnetic fields, again, go right on through, like the wind going through the trees. And it stimulates the body's own capacity for healing. That's what we're doing. We're just providing the body a stimulus to do its own healing that it may or may not be doing as well. Magnetic field therapy enhances virtually all healing in the body. Even if you're taking all the right supplements, you can still do better. It's reusable, clearly, you can keep using it over and over again, and it can be home or professional, complementary to other therapies, and there's a large body of biologic evidence. For example, I have a library of 25,000 abstracts of magnetic field effects on biology. So there's a lot of information out there. This is not a fly-by-night concept. It's not a I said, he said, she said idea. There's a lot of science now. So the benefits are that they interact with almost other therapies. You could use it along with everything else you're doing pretty well. They work deep in the body. That's one of the critical things about magnetic field therapy is it works deep in the body, as opposed to acupuncture, which in a sense works deep in the body, but it really doesn't do direct tissue healing. That's really critical. And you can address stubborn problems much better and faster with PMF therapies. It makes nutrition, supplements, acupuncture, other modalities work better. It enhances. 1 + 1 doesn't equal 2. It could equal 10 or 100 or 1,000. And again, they stimulate the body's own natural potential. So the body, as I said, is transparent to a low frequency or DC magnetic field. Nothing in the body stops, slows, or uses up a magnetic field. PMS pass through the body as if it wasn't even there. Okay, like the wind in the trees, you can't see the wind, but you know it by its actions. So basics, frequency versus pulses per second. Power lines are frequency. Microwaves broadcast in the environment are frequencies. Radar is a frequency. So all these are frequencies, and they basically go out into the environment as a wavelength. PEMFs are different. They're pulses per second. They're created by passing a current through a wire. So the frequencies that are broadcast into the environment are basically what we call open loop. They just go out into the environment. Pulse magnetic fields, by thumb, is the current, the flow of current. Every time there's a pulse in that current, there's a perpendicularly created magnetic field. And that's an open loop. That's a closed loop. So it always collapses back on itself. It does not go out into the environment. It only goes out into the environment to the extent of the strength of the magnetic field and the pulse rate of that magnetic field. But it passes through everything that's up next to that magnetic field. It's going to pass right through it for the most part. But it's not a wavelength. So that's a very key distinction. And that's why EMFs can be bad for us, and PEMFs are designed for health purposes primarily. EMFs are designed for communication, essentially. Electromagnetic fields, environmental magnetic fields like Wi-Fi are designed for communication. They're not designed for health. And therefore, they could be harmful to health. Whereas PEMFs are generally designed for health. So intensities, you were talking about milligauss. These are the terms that we use. Most of the time, what we're using is Gauss. So 1 Tesla is 10,000 Gauss. 1 Gauss is 0.0001 Tesla. Millitesla is the most common term that we're using for PEMFs in general. You're going to see that term more often than any other, except for the very low intensity systems, which generally are microtesla. So a QRS is like 70 microtesla. Okay, which is less than 1 Gauss. The Earth's magnetic field is 0.5 Gauss, 50 microtesla. In general, the Earth's magnetic field is 50 microtesla. So we're already bathed in a huge magnetic environment. Our biology, all biology on the planet is conditioned by that environment. And we rely on that environment. And magnetic fields, pulse magnetic fields interact with that basic magnetic environment that we're surrounded by. Studies have shown that when you put something in a Faraday cage and then you stimulate it with electromagnetic fields or pulse fields, you don't get the same reactions as if it's live in the background environment. So basically, there's an interaction between those. That's very important. So total dose. The total dose of a magnetic field treatment is going to be the Gauss, the intensity, times the treatment time, plus the number of treatments. So when you look at magnetic field treatments, you can't just look at an individual session or an individual treatment. You have to look at the dose and the time that it takes for actions to happen. Now you get all these biologic actions, these physiologic actions, that can happen in milliseconds or microseconds, even in tissues. But it's the amount of time that you need to keep that going, because many reactions in the body, once you stimulate, extinguish very rapidly. Some of them go on for days, but many of them actually happen really fast. So you have to keep retreating to get a momentum built up in the body for healing purposes. So total dose becomes important. So when you think about magnetic fields, now this chart is from my book, Supercharge Your Health. So I help people to figure out whether they should do local treatments or whole body treatments. And then you have things like what the intensity is, whether it's low, medium, or high. And these are Gauss. And then very high is less than 1,000. Well, that's arbitrary units, but basically that's the scales that I was using. For a whole body, you have the same thing, low, medium, high, or very high. The QRS, I would consider to be low. In fact, I would consider a QRS to be very low, but I say between 0.1 and 10 Gauss. The Beamer, same thing, 0.1 to 10 Gauss. IMRS, 0.1 to 10 Gauss. So all of these OMI, all of these are very, very, very low intensity systems. And even their smaller applicators don't get up very high. They rarely get up into the 1 or 2 Gauss range. And that's critical, and I'll show you why in a second. So again, you can, all these devices that I've got on my website, I've tested, I've used, I support, because I know what they do. And therefore I can know how to treat based on what I understand, the physics or the technical specifications of those systems. I know what they will do. And then these are some of the devices I recommend for chiropractors. Chiropractors, for the most part, anybody in a clinical setting really needs to be doing high intensity therapy. You're basically just not getting any other benefit. With the QRS, the IMRS, and the Beamer, because they're so shallow, because they're so weak, what they're essentially doing is stimulating the acupuncture points and the meridians. And that's why people feel a benefit. They feel good. Because you're doing all the, at one time, laying on one whole body mat, all of a sudden you're turning on the whole acupuncture system. Not just one point, but the whole system is being activated. And we've discovered, since I ended my training in acupuncture, we now know that magnetic field therapy is interacting with the acupuncture system, because the acupuncture system is a DC current system. Even though we talk about chi, because the ancients didn't know about voltage or amperage and so on. They called it chi. Well, we now know that chi is actually current, and then it's flowing through that DC current system. It's a very low level system. It's a constantly flowing system, and it can be very easily interrupted, very easily upset. So this is one example of a system that I recommend called the ParMed's UltraFlash. So it has 2 whole body pads. It has a 7-inch coil and a 12-inch loop coil. And you combine these in different ways. You can twist that loop coil into a figure of 8. Now, this is kind of like the specifications of the UltraFlash. So it has 10 programs in it. Each program, each time you turn it on, it essentially runs for 30 minutes. And then there's a range of pulses per second. Many people continue to use the term hertz, even though hertz should truly apply to frequencies, true frequencies or wavelengths. But anyway, the 5 pulses per second for 0, and then it drops down to 0.67 pulses per second at the highest intensities. And this is very common for high intensity systems. The stronger the magnetic field is being produced, the slower the pulse is. And that has to do with the engineering, because the capacitors have to fully, like a flash on a camera, it has to recharge itself before you can flash it again. So magnetic field therapy is like that. It has to recharge before you can flash it again. And if you're talking about 5 pulses per second and you're trying to produce a very high intensity field, you need very robust electronics to be able to produce rapid pulses at high intensity. So the whole body mat on the UltraFlash goes from 1600 Gauss 1600 Gauss, not microtesla or milligauss, 1600 Gauss to 4000. The loop coil at the edge of the coil itself, at the edge of that loop, that's where the field is the strongest. It's 2000 Gauss, but it goes up to 7000. And then the folded loop coil, if you fold it on top of itself, twist it around onto a butterfly coil, or you use that 7-inch pad, it goes from 3000 Gauss to 10,000 Gauss, so 1 Tesla. All right, so it's a pretty strong magnetic system. So you have a fair bit of variability and utility with it. So intensity matters. Why? And this is the key principle behind pulse magnetic fields and how they work. Absolutely critical principle. The people who sell the IMRS, the QRS, and the Beamer, what is this? What are you talking about? Physics. What are you talking about? They don't understand Faraday's law at all, and they don't care, and they don't want to, because actually, if you just understand Faraday's law, you'll understand that's why those systems don't work. So time-varying magnetic fields induce an electric field whose magnitude is proportional to its rate of change. Faraday discovered this. When you take a loop of wire, copper wire, and in that loop you insert a bulb, and you turn on the switch or you open the loop. If you open the circuit, then nothing happens. If you close that circuit and you flash a magnetic field across that copper wire, what happens? The light bulb lights up. You turn off the magnetic field, the light bulb doesn't light anymore. And this is all dB/dt. So D stands for delta, which is change. B is the intensity of the magnetic field and the change in time. So it's a rate of change, and the magnitude, the change of the magnitude as well is important. So here's a depiction of this. So no magnetic field goes from 0 to max without time involved. Clearly, it takes some time for that to happen. So that's dt. And then from 0 to 100% would be the change in intensity. So the faster this change in intensity, the more charge is produced in the body. Critical. And most of the time with magnetic systems, you almost never see dB/dt given to you. And that's called the skew rate. We almost never get that number. If you got that number, then we'd be able to do more accurate comparisons between different devices and systems. It's very hard to get this number from the manufacturers. So we know that the body, so why does a magnetic field interact with the body to produce charge? Faraday's law, copper wires, basically the mineral copper, the ions in the copper are interacted with by the magnetic field to produce charge. So the body produces charge because we have natural motion of ions and other charges along almost all cell membranes, all molecular structures in the body have charge associated with them. They're usually charged positively or negatively. Most of the time, rarely are they neutral. Most of the time, they're charged. So PEMFs interact with natural charge existing in the body, primarily through the electrolyte. So the body is not saline, is it? We say the body's saline, right? It's not. It's electrolyte soup. It's actually an ionic soup. So it's not even electrolytes, because proteins also have charge associated with them. And they're not really ions per se. It's not like calcium ions or chloride ions. So basically, magnetic fields are interacting with virtually all the structures of the body. So PEMFs can stimulate the body to produce the amount of charge, healing, and other actions only to the extent it is that the body's capable of interacting with it. The body cannot be overcharged, as can happen with E-stim. So with magnetic field therapy, you're doing what's called inductive coupling with the electrical processes of the body or electronic processes of the body. Whereas with E-stim, you're doing capacitive coupling. Inductive coupling, so we are inducing charge in the body with the magnetic field. And you can't overproduce energy because the body's got to do it. With capacitively coupled, you can burn the tissues. You can burn the body because you're not inducing it, you're introducing it as opposed to inducing it. So the inverse square law is critical as well. Magnetic fields, like sound, like heat, color, radiation, all drop off very rapidly. We as doctors know that you have, if you're going to do radiation therapy to the body, you have to calculate the dose. And that calculation is performed using Newton's inverse square law. So you know how much drop off in intensity you're going to have with a distance away from the source of the radiation. And again, we're not talking about ionizing radiation, but any radiation, heat, light, cold, sound, etc. So that's the inverse square law. So 1,000 Gauss magnetic field starts 1 centimeter into the body. 1,000 Gauss magnetic field, 1 centimeter into the body, has lost 75% of its magnetic field. 75% of the magnetic field is gone in 1 centimeter. And then you can see what the huge drop off is with distance. All right, that's critical. So calculating the dose becomes important. Now, one of the key parameters that I use to judge the magnetic fields and what they're going to do, and the way I primarily use magnetic field therapy, is to influence inflammation. And what health process, what disease process, what infirmity process, even aging is not associated with inflammation. So if you do nothing else in the body except to deal with inflammation, you're already doing a lot. And what research has shown is that the optimal magnetic field intensity to decrease inflammation through the adenosine receptor on white blood cells, neutrophils, is about 15 Gauss, 1.5 millitesla. That's the optimal magnetic field intensity at the adenosine receptor. So then you have to calculate the dose based on inverse square law. So that's what we're trying to do then, is that if you're starting off with a beamer, or you're starting off with a QRS, you're starting off at less than 1 Gauss anyway. It's not even going to help to treat superficial inflammation to any great extent, because there's just not enough field there to do the right job. Now, you can, at lower intensities, you can still get a benefit. You just have to do a lot more treatment time to get a benefit. It's not going to be as good or as robust, but it plateaus as well. So at about 1.5 millitesla, it basically plateaus. After that, the body essentially ignores the magnetic field. These charts are in my Supercharge Your Health book. So this table shows you that if you're trying to treat 2 inches into the body, the target depth is 2 inches into the body, you need a 540 Gauss magnetic field to deliver 15 Gauss. At 4 inches into the body, you need to have 1,800 Gauss to deliver 15 Gauss. In other words, to target inflammation. And it gets even bigger. So across a brain, if you're trying to treat from one side of the brain to the other, that's about 6 inches. So at 6 inches into the body, you need almost a 4,000 Gauss magnetic field to deliver 15 Gauss across the skull. And it doesn't matter whether it's bone or muscle or whatever, brain tissue, it's going to go through that body, the body part, equally, regardless of what the tissue is. There's no attenuation based on tissue, especially for the high intensities. Now, to go deeper into the body, say you want to go from the back of the chest to the front of the chest, let's say it's 8 inches, you're going to need 6,000 Gauss. So in a practice setting, if you have a higher magnetic field intensity system, you've got the most flexibility to be able to treat across that whole spectrum of needs, depending on the depth that you're treating. So if you're only treating tennis elbow, if that's all you're ever treating is tennis elbow, you only need about 15 Gauss, maybe 200. So magnetic fields, PEMFs versus EMFs, I mentioned open loop. EMFs are open loop, they're broadcast into the environment. PEMFs are closed loop, the right-hand rule. All right, just an example. This is an electromagnetic wave. L is the wavelength, the lambda, that's a symbol for wavelength. And the magnetic field is perpendicular to the electric field, always. Basic physics. So, and this is an example to show you the dynamic aspect of it. So as you increase the electric wave, you automatically at the same time are increasing the perpendicular magnetic wave. Electric wave produces the magnetic wave, and they're perpendicular to each other. All right, I think you could appreciate that. Then we go back to physiologic effects. So this is a list, and they're in both the books. This is a list of the physiologic effects of PEMFs. Acupuncture stimulation, we already mentioned. It has antibacterial, antifungal, antiviral effects to some extent. Not great, but at the very least, it helps the body to fight those. It initiates the healing processes and inflammation. Has natural anticoagulant effects, both fibrinolytic as well as antiplatelet. Anti-edema, inflammation, spasm, ATP production, really critical. 200 to 400% increase in ATP production in the area of the magnetic field stimulation. Autophagy improves that. Autophagy influences the brain, circadian rhythms, circulation. Clearly, this is one of the claims of the beamer. oh, we improve circulation. All magnetic fields improve circulation. Even static magnets improve circulation. So that's a natural consequence of all PEMFs. Increases in collagen, detox. We now have, there's research now showing that PEMFs increase or stimulate the endocannabinoid system. There are endocannabinoid receptors throughout the whole body, and PEMFs stimulate the endocannabinoid system. Healing and regeneration. Doesn't matter whether you're a heart or a bone or a nerve, it's going to stimulate those tissues as well. Oxygen production. PEMFs help oxygen transport across lung membranes. And then once they're attached to the hemoglobin releases them more quickly with that magnetic field stimulation. So again, there's a huge long list. And this is critical in the way I think, because it doesn't matter what the disease is. Each disease is going to have a different sort of set of these parameters, these physiologic actions with it. So essentially, it really doesn't matter. It's not disease specific. It's much more, in a sense, function specific or effect specific. And on top of that, you and I, the person doing the stimulation, doesn't decide what's going to happen in the body. The body decides what's going to happen. So circulation may happen before inflammation reduction happens. Circulation is good, and inflammation reduction are going to happen before the tissue heals itself, or a wound heals or is healed. All right. So again, this chart's in that Supercharge Your Health book. PEMFs increase stem cells. Key aspect of PEMF therapy. There's about a 400% increase in neural stem cells, and at the same time, about 150 growth factors are expressed. You can't heal the tissue. You can stimulate healing and stimulate DNA and RNA, right? But you have to give that tissue growth factors, or it won't grow, won't regenerate. So this is critical. It's key. Magnetic fields basically by themselves stimulate stem cells. So if you're doing stem cell therapies, you should always be, in my mind, you should always be combining stem cell therapy with PEMF therapy. You can't grow a garden in a swamp. PEMFs get rid of the swamp, and then they stimulate the tissue to heal. They decrease the circulation, increase ATP production, and so on. All of that is needed to repair that wound. And ATP, as I said, got to keep that up when you're healing anything. And who is not deficient in ATP to some extent? Aging is ATP, loss of ATP, largely. So the majority of ATP is recycled from ADP and back again. At any given time, the total amount of ATP plus ADP remains constant. ATP by itself is essentially useless. It has to be hydrolyzed. You have to strip off one of the phosphates to release energy. So the energy production of the body from ATP is not done by the ATP, it's done by the hydrolysis of ATP. And we hydrolyze about 50 to 75 kilograms of ATP, hydrolyze 50 to 75 kilograms of ATP per day. So humans will typically use up their body weight of ATP every day. Each ATP molecule is recycled 500 to 750 times per day. It's constantly recycling. So you make it, hydrolyze, use it, remake it, reuse it, and so on. So using magnetic field therapy then becomes really important for maintaining the health of the body, not just for repair and regeneration, but maintenance of the body then is also part of this. So one study found that even 20 minutes of PEMF therapy increases ATP by an average of 100% and maximally up to 600%. One of the key ways that I think about magnetic field therapy in the body is a cell injury model. Doesn't matter what the injury, the source of injury is to a cell. Injury to a cell reduces ATP, causes mitochondrial damage, changes the flow of oxygen, of calcium ions into and out of the cells. It increases reactive oxygen species, causes membrane damage. In other words, it starts to close off channels in the membranes, and then you get protein misfolding. So PEMF therapy actually, in that long list of actions that PEMFs have, basically touches each one of these. So any cell injury is impacted and improved by magnetic field therapy. Now, healing doesn't happen overnight, right? You have to know the level of the illness or the level of damage, and you have to know the healing rates of the tissues. Once you know that as a clinician, then you can have some sense, given the magnetic field, of how long that PEMF signal is going to impact the healing. So I classify the levels of illness into 3 stages: energetic, physiologic, pathophysiologic, and pathologic. Okay, at the energetic stage, in the terms of a cold, you're tired and achy. The physiologic stage, you're sneezing and having a runny nose. Pathophysiologic, you're coughing, you're producing up phlegm. Now, if you have cellular damage. And then pathologic, of course, is pneumonia or abscesses or more severe levels of that illness. So energetic stages with PEMF therapy can be responded to within minutes to hours. Physiologic stages are hours to days. Pathophysiologic stages, depending on the degree of pathology versus the degree of physiology, is days to weeks, and pathologic can take weeks to maybe never, weeks to years. How long does it take to heal a fracture? We could take the cast off in about 12 weeks. But is the fracture healed? The answer is no. It could take a couple of years, leaving to the body's own natural resources. It could take a couple of years for that fracture site to not show up on an X-ray. So tissues heal at their own rates. Corneas in about 24 hours, small nerves, 2 millimeters a day, large nerves, 5 millimeters a day, brain maybe never, bone 2+ years, etc. So every tissue heals in its own rate. And if you have a fracture, what tissues are damaged in a fracture? There are a lot of tissues damaged in a fracture. It's not just the bone. Now, PEMF therapy has been approved by the FDA for healing non-union fractures. And those magnetic fields that were approved 25 years ago through research done at Cornell and NYU, what they found is that 18 Gauss was a good signal to help with non-union fractures, but you needed to use it for 9 hours a day. Now, even if the non-union was 7 years old, you could reinitiate the healing process, even of an old non-union, with magnetic field therapy. But it takes about 9 hours a day. So they did a survey of people who had devices, and then they went back and interviewed them relative to how much time they used the treatment for, and then how long it took for them to heal the non-union at some level, however you define healing. But anyway, if you did 9 hours a day, you healed 76 days earlier. In other words, it took you almost 4 months to heal. But if you did 3 hours or less a day, it took you 6 months to heal. So the time spent in treatment, the dose, the total dose, becomes really important, knowing the magnetic field and the problem that you're dealing with and the timelines for that tissue to heal. So higher intensity PEMFs get better results faster with less treatment time. That's the rule of thumb. The higher intensity, better results faster with less treatment time. Now, magnetic fields are magic. Clearly they're magic, but they don't work on their own. Magnetic fields do not raise the dead. I tell people that magnetic fields won't raise the dead, but magnetic fields can help the living dead, not the dead. Right? So but in order to do that, you need nutrients. You need functional cells. They have to have the capacity to regenerate and repair. They need fuel. They need energy to do their work. And the energy can be natural or stimulated. If you leave it to the body's own resources, you're essentially leaving things to chance. Surgeons. When you have surgery, what does a surgeon do to help you to heal your wound? Cross your fingers, right? They don't give you anything to help you to heal your wound. They don't use magnetic field therapy to help you to heal your wound better, faster. So wounds typically heal in half the time with magnetic stimulation than they would without magnetic stimulation. So stimulation is better than chance for the most part, and you're less likely to have breakdown and pathology and infections and so on. So again, the basic rapid magnetic field effects are pain reduction, improvements in circulation, improvements in oxygenation of tissues, anti-edema, getting rid of edema helps tissues to be oxygenated, anti-inflammatory, muscle relaxation effects, nerve stimulation effects, both stimulation and also reducing excitation, healing acceleration, anticoagulant effects, very important. Russian surgeons discovered that when they did magnetic field therapy before they did orthopedic surgeries, those patients didn't get clots. We now use heparin on a regular basis. Magnetic fields have very similar actions to the same dose of aspirin, almost equivalent to aspirin, but in addition to what aspirin does, it's fibrinolytic. So any clot that's forming will actually also break down and not go to completion. Reduce bruising, acupuncture, ATP, we mentioned. And frequency PEMFs can be used to stimulate the brain. You can put the brain to sleep, or you can make the brain awake. And then we mentioned the endocannabinoid system, which goes with the nervous system, and again, sensation and the body's ability to heal as well, the nervous system in particular. So the PARMED's flash systems are solid state. There are other magnetic systems that, like the Hugo, for example, that are capacitive discharge. So they, because they have capacitors, those capacitors, like spark plugs, have to be replaced. Solid state systems don't have to be replaced. However, a capacitor discharge system is analog. Solid state systems are digital. So an analog signal means there's a lot more information in that signal than there is in a pure solid state signal. So you get this wobble effect as the signal decays. And so you get a little bit more information, you get a little more value to stimulating the tissue. So a lot of European doctors are using these capacitive discharge systems in Europe primarily for cancer. Or they see better benefits with those systems for cancer because of this extra stimulation. So for most practices, I recommend the UltraFlash, most value, solid state, can treat 2 people at a time. So it has 2 applicators. You could do 2 channels at the same time without loss of energy to either channel. It has the downside that you can't separately control the intensities for each channel. So it becomes a challenge to treat 2 people at the same time. But you can mix and match applicators. You have 10 intensity settings, and it's official intensity to feel muscle contraction. You could actually stimulate the motor endpoint to produce a muscle contraction. All right, these are the different types of flash devices. So the MultiFlash is about 4,000 Gauss maximum intensity. UltraFlash is about 10. MultiFlash and Premium Flash, unfortunately, you can only use 1 applicator at a time. But they are still very useful depending on the problems you're treating. So for osteoporosis or for generalized arthritis or autoimmune diseases or cancer, I usually will recommend the UltraFlash. Because that with osteoporosis, you're treating the whole skeleton at the same time, above and below. Remember the loss of the intensity of the magnetic field. If you're treating the whole skeleton in between those 2 applicators, you're stimulating all the bones. And what are the most common fractures in osteoporosis? It's not the hips and the spine, and that's what we test for, DEXA scanning. But the most common fractures are wrists, hands, fibulas, feet, collarbones. They're the most common. So with UltraFlash, you're basically preventing fractures throughout the whole skeleton. And with breast cancer in particular, because you have breast cancer stem cells in the bones, at the time of initial diagnosis, 40 to 60% of women who have initial diagnosis of breast cancer already have stem cells in their bones, breast cancer stem cells. That's why 15 to 20 years later, we see these women showing up with metastases, bone mets. So I think every woman with a breast cancer diagnosis, basically any person with a solid tumor, solid organ cancer tumor, or solid organ cancer should have bone prevention therapy for the rest of their life to decrease stem cell stimulation. And what's the most common cause of stem cell activation? Inflammation. So if you reduce inflammation in the body, in general, you'll decrease the risk of the stem cells being activated. This is the front side of the UltraFlash, very simple display. This is the program number. This goes around in circles as the system is working. This is the countdown, the timer countdown. Simple start, pause, start, program stop, etc. Very simple system to use. It's the back. It's got 2 channels, 2 applicator channels. Okay, that's again a picture of that system with a 7-inch pad, 12-inch loop coil. This is a half body pad, which I rarely recommend, and then the 2 whole body pads, which you could run at the same time, creating a whole body magnetic therapy or a magnetic sandwich. And I describe the magnetic sandwich concept better in the Supercharge Your Health book. These are the applicators again. You could use them in various configurations. This is one of my favorite configurations called the elliptical coil. You can actually take that loop coil and you can put it in a sock or a stocking, and it brings the sides closer together, but you don't want them touching. You bring the sides closer together and you significantly increase the magnetic field between them. So I use that across the head, the brain a lot, back of the neck, across the hip, across the shoulder, because again, it's flexible. That's what the 7-inch pad is not flexible. Okay, we showed this already, so we won't go into that again. Now, high intensity versus low intensity claims. So you'll hear people arguing, the QRS people, the IMRS people, the Beamer people, they say, well, high intensity hurts you. It's damaging. Well, then that should be true for MRIs. if you restrict people from having an MRI with metal in their bodies or electronic equipment in their bodies, although these days more and more electronic implanted equipment is MR compatible, up to 1.5 Tesla. So, but even so, MRI machines operate safely at 4 to 7 Tesla. TMS has been approved by the federal government for treatment of resistant depression, and that goes to 10,000 Gauss, to the brain. So if there's an organ that should be sensitive to magnetic field therapy, it should be the brain, right? But 10,000 Gauss, 1 Tesla is safe to the brain. Much research has been done on intensities above 30 Gauss, upwards of thousands of Gauss that are beneficial with no negative side effects. You just have to go low and slow. Very low intensity does most of its work on the acupuncture system. As I mentioned, research review shows minimal benefit for disease management with low intensity magnetic fields. There was actually a comparative study, a review study that looked at low intensity whole body systems for specific diseases with almost no value. I actually participated in a study at the UVA for rheumatoid arthritis, and they didn't publish the paper because there was almost no benefit with 30-minute treatments for RA pain. And that was using the QRS. And the QRS, IMRS, they're all basically the same. So again, just remember daily versus continuous treatments. So we can be using magnetic field therapy for hours and hours at a time, even high intensity systems. And continuous therapy for some lesions produces more significant benefits. Reactions to PEMFs: drowsiness, temperature increases, and inflammation. Free radical production. So free radical is good news and bad news. There's 2 aspects to it. You can increase pain with very inflamed nerves. So if you overpower the system, you give too much energy to the system, you're causing the system to work. You're causing the cells to work. And if they're inflamed and damaged, it's hard to get somebody with a broken leg to run. Right? You need to do the appropriate amount of stimulation for the amount of damage you're working with. We certainly get improved circulation, and that's a good thing generally. Sometimes it's a bad thing because people start all of a sudden feeling a lot more sensation in those tissues with circulation improvements. Temperature and swelling can happen, increased bruising, sleep changes. Some people get overstimulated with magnetic field therapy with high dose intensities or high intensity systems. Some people get put to sleep. So I warn people about that. If you are awakened by it, you have too much ATP stimulation, or your brainwaves are starting to go too fast, then you back off and start doing the treatment earlier in the evening. Overdoing activity. People will often feel so much better with magnetic field therapy. Now they start to become overactive, and their tissues aren't healed yet, but they become overactive. That's what happens with a cast. If you take a cast off at 12 weeks, wound's not healed, the fracture is not completely healed yet, so you still don't overdo that fracture site. And I said, one of the biggest side effects with magnetic field therapies is the urge to put on a cape. I said, it's okay. You can put as many capes on as you want. Just don't try to jump over anything tall. The landing can be rough. Hypersensitivity is a possibility. So there are people who are hypersensitive to PEMFs. They usually have pain centralization. They often have severe allodynia. There's a lot of anticipatory fear. If you've reacted once to a magnetic field, now you have anticipatory fear. And so even a positive change in the body is a change, and that's a threat. That's perceived as a threat. Multiple chemical sensitivity. Again, if you're reacting to almost everything, all of a sudden you're starting to improve circulation. If you're detoxing at the same time as you improve circulation, well, then that could create a significant reaction from what you're detoxing. Mast cell activation, PMF stimulation increases circulation. As a result, you start to get activation in mast cells. And so you can have a very significant mast cell activation. So you have to know whether that's already a problem for that person, in which case you go low and slow. If they already have significant inflammation, I've discovered a new problem called ischemia reperfusion. Brains that people who have chronic fatigue syndrome often are overstimulated by PEMF therapy because all of a sudden you're increasing perfusion in the brain that's ischemic. You have areas of hypoxia in areas of inflammation. And when you start to stimulate circulation into those areas, then you get reperfusion injury, in quotes, you get a reaction. So this is becoming important now when we're starting to treat chronic fatigue syndrome. we may have to go low and slow because that brain can't take too much stimulation too fast. You're also more likely to have hypersensitivity with systems that have primarily multiple frequencies. So the QRS, the IMRS, a lot of these low intensity systems have multiple frequencies. And then you don't know which frequency is causing the reaction. It's just too much stimulation all at once. A single pulse, bang, 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 doesn't tend to produce the same kind of reactions. It's not as overstimulated. Contraindications. All right, I used to say that pregnancy was a contraindication. I used to say implanted electronics were contraindications, and you'll often see these contraindications show up in a lot of the online literature. Pacemakers and defibrillators, all these are now often MR compatible. So you have to ask, is your implanted electronics MR compatible? Have you told that you can't do an MRI? If you've been told you can't do an MRI, then you have to watch the intensity. You have to watch the magnetic field, the intensity of the magnetic field in the area of that implant. Pregnancy is relative. There's just no safety information on pregnancy, but we do know that women get pregnant and continue to work in MRI environments. So our practical experience has been that women who do magnetic field therapy in pregnancy breeze through their pregnancies. A lot of the discomforts that they have in pregnancy just don't happen. So it doesn't seem to impact the fetus. But again, it hasn't been rigorously studied, so we still use that as a relative contraindication. The only absolute contraindication that I have is transplants. And you don't read about that either. And most of the people who talk about side effects. Doesn't matter what the intensity of the magnetic system is. I would not do it with a transplant. Any transplant, whether it's corneas or solid organs, because you're immunosuppressed. And magnetic field therapy can suppress immunity, but it can also enhance immunity, aka the neutrophil receptor. So as a result, you don't want an organ rejection. It's just best to stay away from transplants in general with magnetic field therapy, anywhere in the body. Because you can't just say, I'm only going to treat the foot. Well, what happens in the foot stimulates the immune system in that foot, but now that enters the general circulation, and so it can affect the whole body. Tumors near critical structures. Sometimes magnetic field therapy increases the size of the tumor by virtue of increasing circulation to the tumor. So that usually ends after some period of time with magnetic field therapy, because basically the body's helping the immune system to fight the cancer. But you can get a temporary increase in the size of the tumor. If you do, due to a vascular effect, if it's near a critical structure, the brain in particular, next to an aorta, or next to a renal vein or a renal artery, etc. So again, you have to be careful about that. Metallic vascular clips are important to be mindful of with high intensity magnetic fields. If you have a vascular clip in your brain, do you want that magnetic field to be tugging on that clip while the vessels are pulsating? I would say no. That's not a common contraindication, but it does happen. So we have to ask about, just like with MRIs, we have to ask if you have any metal clips in your body. So cautions, bleeding disorders, because we have an anticoagulant effect. Should you be doing magnetic therapy the day of surgery because of the risk of bleeding from the wound? You could get oozing as well as actually active bleeding through larger blood vessels. Myasthenia gravis is not a problem. And there's a contraindication with a relative caution with autoimmune disorders, because you could temporarily increase inflammation. And so if you have a very severe myasthenia gravis, you could temporarily make the myasthenia gravis worse. Because you're increasing circulation, you increase inflammation, which is a good thing in the long run. But in the short run, it can, in a very severe autoimmune process, somebody's really, really sick with their autoimmune disease, RA, lupus, etc., then you have to be more careful. If somebody's got a history of Graves' disease, then you have to be really careful. You have to monitor the TSHs and the T3s and T4s really carefully, because you can stimulate the gland to produce a lot more hormone. You may be able to help the gland actually convert T4 to T3 better, faster. So you have to monitor for that. Antipsychotics. Again, you don't know how the antipsychotics are going to be metabolized. But on top of that, you're already talking about a thought disorder. So people with thought disorders can interpret magnetic field therapies in just a lot of weird ways that you can't control. So that antipsychotics are a problem. They're not necessarily an absolute contraindication, but they're a caution. I tell people that, do you really want to be dealing with borderline personalities? If you're a psychiatrist, you don't have a whole lot of choice, I suppose. But the rest of us in regular common practice, if we have somebody with a BPD, borderline personality disorder, run. Right? They're going to make your life absolutely miserable, and they will find every excuse to think of that the magnetic field is hurting them, even if it isn't. All they have to do is imagine it. All right, when to add home treatment? It's a matter of clinical judgment. More likely necessary for more severe problems that are chronic, with little likelihood of significant tissue healing or reversal of pathology. So the worse the problem is, the more time it's going to take to do treatment. And if you're only doing one treatment a week in the office or a couple of treatments a week in the office, there's just not enough treatment time. The total dose is not going to be good enough to do adequate healing. So often what you may want to do is to do office treatment and bridged home treatment. So people would have their own PMF system. They may not be able to afford a high intensity device that costs $20,000 or $12,000, but they may be able to afford a $2,000 or $3,000 machine that they can do daily treatments at home to help to make the office treatments work even better, faster. So if their patients are not getting sustainable benefits from office treatments, bridging home treatment may be better. All right, patient's own personal preference. You have to balance ongoing office treatments versus home treatment cost. Again, the person's going to have to decide that. So if they don't want to keep paying for office treatments that you're going to have to do for another 2 or 3 months, 2 or 3 times a week, then okay, then they may be better off having their own home-based equipment. The need for nighttime use. If a pain comes back and disturbing people's sleep, then again, they may be more likely to need something in the home setting. We do have a lease-to-own option available for clinicians. And we do have something called a referral partner program. So those of you on the call who may want to refer people to our website or recommend our devices to them, we have a referral partner program. So the patient gets a bit of a discount and the office gets a referral fee. If you could do that, if you want referral fees, if you don't want referral fees, we can give that referral fee back to the patient. And one of the common devices that I recommend for the home setting is a portable PEMF device. It's low intensity. It's about 200 Gauss. It has 10 frequencies in it, 10 programs, frequency range of 3 hertz to 1,000 hertz. Most of them are under 100, and runs 10 to 60 minutes or continuous battery operation. So you can set the time that you want it to run for. So this allows you to use it overnight. This is very useful or very handy for insomnia because you can put it on the pillow and run it all night long. Also, pain wakes people up during the night. Then again, a signal for the brain to help them to sleep better would help them with their pain as well. This is a low intensity regional whole body system. So we talked about the QRS, or the Beamer, or the IMRS. This system was developed to compete with those because a Beamer, for example, can cost $10,000. An IMRS can cost $5,000. A QRS can cost $5,000. So they're more expensive than they need to be because some of these systems are sold through multi-level marketing companies. So the BioBalance was designed to be 10 Gauss, almost 10 times stronger than the Beamer, all these other devices. The whole body pad and the smaller applicator are 10 Gauss each. And it's only about $3,800 versus $6,000. So the BioBalance is about 10 Gauss, as I mentioned, and it could run from 10 minutes to 12 hours. You could run 2 applicators at a time. So it's handy that way from a health maintenance perspective. PARMES devices we went over already. And then going low and slow. So you don't run a marathon getting off the couch right away. You have to train. Magnetic field therapy is essentially cellular exercise. And you don't know what that tissue can tolerate, how fast it can go, how much intensity you can throw at it. So I usually recommend testing people by going at slower paces in terms of increasing the intensity and increasing the treatment time. So every person is going to be different. What I used to do in the practice is I would have people on a high intensity system. I put a coil over their shoulder, for example. And I said, I'm going to take the intensity up to discomfort. Tell me when you start to feel discomfort. I keep increasing the intensity until they say, I feel discomfort. Then I say, now I have to know what you can't tolerate. So I'm going to take this up to a point where you tell me stop. And then I know between discomfort and intolerance what I should probably be doing in the office setting. No pain, no gain. It's actually better for the patient to feel discomfort because then they know something's working. That's actually doing something. And then as the healing begins to happen, as they begin to get relief, then what happens is they gradually begin to increase the intensity. So the goal usually is maximum intensity and maximum time based on the optimization of the tissues. All right, what else should you be doing? Hydration, magnesium and calcium, melatonin. Women especially seem to have been found to decrease their melatonin. The body perceives magnetic field frequencies or the pulses of the magnetic fields as if it was light. So the melatonin system can begin to shut down. So you may need to provide them with more melatonin. Besides, it's very helpful now for antioxidant support. So again, you may want to use antioxidants at the time of treatment because there could be a flood of antioxidants, especially at the beginning, that could cause more distress. All right, we talked about these. And on my website, drpawluk.com, I do have a buyer's guide. So the PEMF buyer's guide, you could do a search on that. And that talks about what people need to think about in terms of who you're buying it from, the credibility of the people that are selling it, how much support you're going to get, etc. So that's part of the PEMF buyer's guide. And then these are the resources. So we talked about the referral partner program. We have our lease to own option, the buyer's guide. We also have on drpawluk.com on the home page, on the right side, you can see product comparison. So this is a list of all the different products, their intensities, their costs, and some of their other features. So that's a handy document. Many people print that out. And there's a video there also on that page, at the top of that page, how to choose and use a PEMF system. And then, as I mentioned, the books. So there you go. There's a rapid journey through PEMF therapy.
Excellent. That was awesome, Dr. Pawluk. And just before questions, so I've been, talking to several of my patients about the PEMF systems and encouraging them to call you. And of course, Jody should have in the chat where they can get the discount link and so forth. Because yeah, these systems can be a bit pricey. However, the smaller ones, depending on what you're treating, pretty affordable actually. So so what questions do we have out there?
Well, let me make a comment about what you just said. I think it's very important. People tend to make their decisions with PEMFs based on cost.
Absolutely.
Right? Unfortunately, that what happens is that we have to warn them. So if you buy it based on cost, don't expect miraculous results.
That's true.
If it happens, fantastic. But there's a really good chance based on healing timelines, based on the time of use. There's one PEMF system that somebody sells saying all you need is 8 minutes a day.
Right.
Right? Clinically, that doesn't make any sense whatsoever.
Right.
But it's a marketing gimmick.
Of course. Absolutely. And, the vast majority of the listeners on our webinar today are patients and our what we call citizen scientists, very in-depth learners. And so we have a handful of doctors on this. But like I said, a lot of individuals have asked about the benefits of PEMF. And of course, that's why I wanted you on, because you are the consummate, authority on this topic.
Thank you.
What I think we want to do, Michael, we're running short of time, but first of all, thank you so much. That was amazingly succinct and rich in information, just an outstanding presentation. It raises more questions than it answers, only because this topic is not just something that we're fluent in the West. I think the Faraday experiment proved that mechanistically, probably what PEMF is doing, it's just supporting the electron transport chain. It's making electrons available for the most part. Would you agree with that, or is that?
I think, well, yes, and that's the mechanism, but because electrons create current.
Right.
But Faraday's law, basically Faraday's experiment, showed that magnetic field therapy increases charge.
Yeah.
Right. So charge is the key. So once you increase the amount of energy or charge in the tissues, and ATP is only one part of that. Once you increase the amount of energy available, like the millivolts, for example, with a cell membrane, an injured cell builds up charge on the outside of the cell membrane.
Right.
And the reason for that is because the membrane channels are not working anymore.
We measure that with the erythrocyte sedimentation rate, which every cell is a battery, and that's that's a good surrogate for the negative charge on the exterior of all cells. So,
Well, at least circulating cells in the vascular system.
yeah, but I mean, it's, all the phospholipid bilayers, so it could be a surrogate. We don't have definitive proof of that. But, one of the comments was about the high energy fields providing temporary benefit. And my comment to that would be, and I'd like to hear your response, is that when you're using the high intensity ones, they're probably people that are in need of more repair in general. They're going to practitioners, and we're not, there's underlying issues. So we can provide more current, more electrons for healing, but it's not necessarily always, maybe sometimes, treating the underlying cause, which is causing the deficiency in an electrical current flow. That's my guess based on those kinds of accusations without really understanding.
I totally disagree.
Good.
So the issue is treatment time. So the issue is dose.
Mm-hmm.
High intensity PEMFs can be used over and over and over and over again as well, right? And obviously you could dial it down. So the low intensity systems heal, but they barely heal depending on the intensity of the magnetic field. If you're talking about magnetic fields generally less than 200 Gauss, you're not working deep in the body anyway. So really don't talk to me about healing if you're not reaching deep anyway. So the key is that, yes, you have higher intensity. You don't need to treat as long, and you're still throwing the metaphor I use is throwing a rock in a pond.
Mm-hmm.
Every time you throw the rock in the pond, the waves go on after. So there's thousands of biochemical processes that are stimulated by magnetic fields. Some of them are very short-lived, and some of them are very long-lived. So every time you do a treatment, you're, again, regenerating charge production. When you're regenerating charge production, you're regenerating healing. So how often do you have to treat? That's a big question. How often do you have to treat?
Right. It's kind of like going out in the sun. You don't just go out for 20 minutes once a year and expect to have enough vitamin D production or any, glutathione and all that good stuff. So, yeah.
Well, that's why I think most people, as a family physician, holistic physician, I usually want to have people treat themselves at home. So if you get the right system, you're basically doing it every single day.
Right.
You have 100 trillion cells in your body, and every cell has 100,000 biochemical processes per second. How often should you treat?
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
All the time. Just like eating well and exercising. Same thing.
And breathing.
Yeah, something like that, trivial like that. But my only point is, we deal with a lot of chronic fatigue and sort of like chronic Lyme syndrome, and these are electron robbers. And so, you can do all kinds of things to heal, to repair your healing processes. But if that underlying insidious process is still there, then when you stop treatment, guess what? It's likely to come back. That was.
And with
that, I completely agree with you on on duration and intensity. No question about that. From the ultimate effect, the initial effect.
Well, but you're also when you have inflammation, you have energy robbers.
Right.
That what you want to do. One of the reasons you have energy robbers, you have a lot of inflammation.
Mm-hmm.
So as you start to decrease the inflammation, you decrease a lot of this. These processes that are going on in the body, and all of a sudden fatigue starts to go away because not only are you giving more energy at the time you're doing treatment, but you're decreasing the underlying process that's driving all of that disease,
mm-hmm.
right? And that's why you need to treat over a long enough period of time. And that body is going to tell you how much time you need to treat.
Right.
Right. Mm-hmm. I can't tell. People ask me all the time, well, how many minutes should I treat?
Right.
Listen to your body.
I follow the logic. Dr. Harshfield, do I have to run shortly? Land the plane for us.
Okay, Dr. Pawluk, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
There is a lot of questions, maybe a comment or two, that when we injure ourselves in the daytime, we heal faster than if we have a nighttime injury. I'd be interested in your thoughts on when to use the PEMF. And then the second part, Dr. Tennant has got a system, I'm sure you're familiar with that, where he wants to use a transducer to repolarize everything before he tries to recharge it, and then a biomodulator to recharge. I think that he's using a pulsed EMF system or something like this.
It's electrical.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. And the third thing, I'm sorry, this is a lot. Is there a way to measure before and afters? Wouldn't it be cool to be able to go, this is your energy. It's not minus 25 millivolts. Let's say it's 15, minus 15. You do the pulsed EMF for 6 or 8 hours. Hey, it's back to minus 25 or not. Do you have a way of measuring the person before and after your therapies?
And I struggle with that all the time. So, I mean, you can use HRV measurements, you could use thermography measurements, you could use pulse oxes. I actually did a study with pulse oxes in a QRS, and we found a small change in peripheral pulse ox with QRS. So there's so many ways to do it. Unfortunately, you can't measure that millivoltage at the cell easily. There are lots of surrogate ways of measuring it. Most of those studies that have measured those millivoltages at cell membranes use patch clamp techniques. So they're in vitro. So there's really nothing biologically that's easy to use and reliable and consistent and measurable. I worked a lot with devices like BioMeridian and other resonance-based systems, and I don't find them reliable at all. So again, any measure you use, and ultimately the measure for the patient is, am I getting better?
Yep.
Right. That's ultimately going to be the measure.
The other question would be the daytime and nighttime thing, because a lot of folks sleep on these things. Have you noticed that it works a little better in the day or night? Just sort of the body's natural healing mechanism is circadian, tends to want to heal better when injuries and surgery are performed in the daytime than at night.
I don't notice enough. And I think maybe for the very, very low intensity systems, that may be more of a question about whether you get better benefits nighttime versus daytime. I think if you're stimulating all kinds of repair processes in the tissues and you're providing a lot of stimulation to that tissue, it doesn't matter. Because of the rock in the pond, you're causing these processes to start going on, and they go on for hours at a time. So it probably doesn't matter so much. Now, if you happen to be picking nighttime as a starting point, but I can tell you, and from reports that we get from people, is they sleep better at night. Even doing a PEMF therapy session with a high intensity field before bedtime, most people sleep better. Even though we're not treating the tissue directly that you want to induce sleep, they're doing whole body stimulation. The acupuncture system is pushed. So if you're pushing the whole acupuncture system, as well as doing local tissue healing effects, it's hard to know whether it's better one time versus another. So the key is basically, if it works for you, fine. But I would tend to say that if you're using a system to sleep with that's running all night long, you're stimulating that acupuncture system all night long. And you're keeping it in balance for the whole night. So it doesn't get a chance to get out of balance as much as it might otherwise. But cortisol levels, PEMFs can increase cortisol levels. They can decrease cortisol levels. They certainly impact the melatonin system, the endocannabinoid system. So if you're stimulating the endocannabinoid system, then one of the reasons for chronic pain is the endocannabinoid system isn't working as well, and that's why CBD works so well. So there's lots of angles to this question. It sounds like a simple question.
Right.
Yep. And one last point. We've been using PEMF with our stem cell injections and platelet-rich plasma and so forth, and we can look with ultrasound before and after. Even when you inject something, put a needle in someone, there's a hyperemia that happens about 2 minutes after you stick the needle in and inject whatever. The PEMF also induces on its own some increased blood flow into that area, maybe not as much as a needle stick with an injection or something. So we started putting pulsed EMF in with our stem cells platelets, hoping that they weren't going to fight each other. And it actually does help you actually increase flow when you use them both together. So interesting point that you had about that.
I did a presentation actually on the PEMF Training Academy site. I have a lecture that I did to a group of stem cell doctors. And as I said, you can't grow a garden in a swamp. So what you should do, ideally, if you're doing stem cell therapy, you should be doing treatment before the stem cell therapy to help to decrease inflammation, decrease edema, improve circulation, get the tissues humming already, right? So PEMFs by themselves increase stem cells. I had a woman who was harvesting stem cells, and she increased her stem cells by a factor of like 20 to 40 times more than she would have normally by doing magnetic therapy before the stem cell harvest. Then magnetophiles have been found to not only increase the production of stem cells, but they help their differentiation, they help their migration, and they help their survival in the tissue that you've done the stem cell therapy in.
That's interesting. So like you use it as prehab, during the injection, and then the rehab, all three phases.
All three phases. And even longer term, not even rehab, but long term, because obviously stem cells have the tissues that you were creating by doing the stem cells. If you get them to change into the niche that you want the cells to be, they have to survive that niche too. And the probability of them surviving the niche and living to a ripe old age, and then basically being apoptotically harvested and removed, you'll extend their lifespan.